Hi, it's Robert Mendelson, Fractional CMO here in beautiful Montreal, welcoming you to another episode of the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. We're part of Fractional Pros Canada, the home for Canada's fractional community, and you can find us on Facebook. We bring you conversations about everything fractional that matters, for fractional executives and businesses from coast to coast. Think of this as your go-to spot for real talk, practical wisdom, and strategies you can actually use, all without the corporate fluff and with plenty of Canadian content. Whether you're a fractional pro or a business in our great country of Canada and beyond, this conversation is for you. Grab your espresso and let's dive in. Welcome to the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. I'm your host and fractional CMO, Robert Mendelson, here in beautiful Montreal. And joining us from just down the street in beautiful Calgary is Michael Hayward. Michael is a marketing, sales, and customer experience leader with a long history of innovation, primarily in businesses related to travel, hospitality, and technology. And he is now an executive coach to C-suite leaders and also a McKay CEO Forum Chair, helping CEOs become better leaders. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Robert. Pleased to be here.
All right. So, Michael, you have a really interesting background. You worked at the Four Seasons Hotel and Resort chain. Everybody knows them. And you worked your way up literally from a reservations agent and all the way up to the director of interactive marketing and e-commerce. You were overseeing the largest technology investment the company had made in a decade. I'm curious what those early days in the trenches of reservations have taught you about customer experience that most C-suite executives probably miss when they're just sitting there looking at the spreadsheet and the scorecards.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. In the travel industry or in the hotel business, I think of it as the equivalent of starting, by pushing a broom. You are getting to experience the business at a very fundamental level. Now, I worked in the corporate part of the organization. I never actually worked in a hotel, but by talking to travel agents and individuals who are planning to stay and having to learn how to address their questions and, and deal with their concerns or their uncertainty, really had a chance to understand how the hotel works, right? How the pieces get put together and how the customer thinks of their time at the hotel, whether they're traveling for business or they're going for a weekend getaway. You get this real understanding of here are the things they care about. And once you have a good idea about how the customer thinks about their journey through your experience, and hotels have a great challenge in that the experience of the product takes many hours to complete, right? Or days, or it can even be, a week or more. You think about how they put this together in their minds, then when you're thinking about the decisions you make to manage that, you're able to think in terms of the way a customer thinks of it, to put the right things first. Not the things that you care about as an operator, but the things the customer cares about.
Yeah, I think it was Mr. Hilton, founder of the Hilton chain, who once said that he would go into, whenever he visited one of his hotels, he'd go into the rooms sometimes and make sure that the shower curtain was inside the tub and not outside the tub.
Yeah. And you do that with a very particular purpose. We actually, I learned it, funnily enough, from an airline, who we had a guest speaker at one of our marketing events when I was at Four Seasons, to come in and talk to us. And he called it the reverse gravy stain.
Reverse gravy stain. Tell us about this.
So he said, okay, if you get onto one of our planes and you sit down in your seat and you pull down the tray table in front of you and you see that it's dirty, you think that we look after the engines of the airplane just the same way as we look after that tray table. So it's the littlest details that give a customer the greatest confidence in the way you approach your business. So, when Conrad Hilton would do that kind of inspection, and a general manager and a director of housekeeping, they all do these things on a regular basis, right? The housekeepers do great work, and it's always trust but verify, right? So you want to check that the work is done really well, because when the customer comes in, whether they know it specifically, like they see it, or they don't know that they saw it, when they see that level of detail being paid attention to, they feel like everything that you're doing in the hotel or everything you're doing in your business gets treated with that same attention to detail. And that becomes critical to getting the right customer experience. And another thing that happens from, that perspective is sometimes it's what happens at the very beginning of an experience that sets the tone for the entire experience. So when you're staying at a hotel for a week, what happens on the arrival can affect the entire stay, even if everything else is perfect.
And so how do you take that, those lessons you've learned from that, and then you've moved through other types of industries that were related, luxury hotels, senior living, but then to digital agency, airport authority. What's that common connective tissue that now as you're an executive coach and helping other CEOs in their businesses, what's that connective tissue that you find is ubiquitous no matter what kind of business it is, where there's always a little bit of fixing that might need to be done?
Yeah, it's an incredible oversimplification to try to cover this in, a few minutes or an hour. But the truth of it is attention to detail matters, right? And understanding how humans take in information directly, like consciously and subconsciously, and then paying attention to those details sets the right kind of tone, sets the right expectations. So, for example, I spent a couple of years on the executive of the Calgary Airport Authority, and my group, my responsibilities included the customer service group, effectively the front of house. And what we know about airports is that they're places of great anxiety for people. And that anxiety is typically driven by, that fear of missing my flight. That's number one. So when a person encounters a long lineup, right, they start to panic. The panic wells up. They're like, how am I going to get through this in time to get to my plane? And it's not good for airports if people start showing up 3 hours early, because that just overcrowds everything all the time. So, the mantra that we used there, right, based on my experience in other industries, was people come into an airport, they don't really know what to expect, right? So they're on edge. They're looking around very warily because they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to get when I arrive at this place. And I said, the best way to meet or exceed a customer's expectations in that scenario is to set them in the first place. So we would do things like manage the way the queues worked to get to various places. So, the security organization runs the security system, but we set up the queue that you would use to get into the security area. So we put a screen up in those lines that said, here's how long you should expect to wait to get in there. And we got that information from the security organization, from CATSA's website. But we tried to be a little more anticipatory than that in terms of setting the right expectation and then meeting it or exceeding it. We would say, okay, if they say it's going to take 20 minutes to get through this lineup, we're going to add 5 minutes to that. And we're going to say it's 25 minutes. So that way, if you get through in 22 minutes, we win, right? Because we met or exceeded your expectations. So we're going to give ourselves a little buffer, right? And you are going to get a better experience. So you walk into the space, you're like, that's a big lineup. I have no idea what to expect. We set an expectation. You look at that screen and you say, I will make my flight. And then when we get you through a little bit quicker, you're like, hey, that wasn't so bad. And suddenly an anxious experience has turned into, that wasn't so bad experience.
Under promise, over deliver works every time.
It does. And it works in so many businesses. I mean, that came up in a conversation I was having with a client just the other day. if you can figure out how to set the expectation and give yourself room to succeed, then you're going to have a much better shot at having customers tell you you do a good job.
So it's interesting, we're talking about the commonalities of just about every business. At some point, there's a customer experience element that they need to master. And yet a lot of founders seem to think, for whatever the reason, that the problems they have in their business are entirely unique. Interesting paradox.
It is. Again, I can point to a conversation I had just yesterday with somebody who works in a business that I really know nothing about in environmental remediation and environmental assessments. And it's like, that's an interesting business. But we sat down and we were talking about business development. And we started talking about, certain approaches to business development and the challenges that come from that and how you set your forecasts and how you look, and figure out how is my pipeline looking. And my client was like, it's like you were in our leadership meeting yesterday. And it's because these are actually common challenges. So I use a rule of thumb. Nobody's going to agree with me exactly, but that's okay. I say 80% of businesses are pretty much the same, right? I can walk into a business development conversation and I'll know 80% of what's going on. 10% is probably industry specific because there are certain ways you talk about your product or service. There are certain aspects of the way clients buy it or experience it. And then maybe the last 10% we'll say is unique to your business because of the way you've set yourself up to differentiate yourself. So it is true that every business has elements that are unique, but business is business. And most of it, when you bring in some outside help, if they've got experience, it can be across many industries. In fact, sometimes I think that's helpful, right? I've seen a lot of different types of go-to-market approaches or a lot of different types of customer experience design processes, a lot of different types of dashboards and financial reports. It's like, great. So now I've seen a bunch of different types, and I bet I know one that will work pretty well as a starting point for our conversation about your business.
Yeah, I love that you embrace that that diversity of background experience. Myself as a fractional, there's kind of two kinds of fractionals, right? There's there's more, but I'm generalizing, right? You could break them into two general groups. One is the fractionals who decide to go fractional after being in corporate world for a number of years, usually decades. And usually they developed a deep expertise in one vertical, one industry. And that's great. And then you have other guys who are like me, who have worked, I have a very colorful background compared to that, right? I've been an entrepreneur, I've had my own business, I've worked in a variety of different corporate settings, from businesses of 10 people to businesses of thousands of people, in 13 different verticals. And so for some, prospects who are looking for a fractional CMO like me, for some of them, they love the fact that I've got this big diverse experience and they see the additional advantage of having a guy like me come in and help their company versus somebody who's just always worked in their industry. And then you have the other guys who are like, no, I want somebody who's an expert in my industry. That's all I care about. I want somebody who's worked 30 years in it, and that's what I'm interested in. And it's always interesting to see the different sides of that coin, and everybody's take on it is always a little bit different. So it's fascinating to me.
I mean, I'll throw in a last thought about that. Again, it might be an oversimplification. I think if everything in your business is going great and you just need more bandwidth, get somebody who's got deep experience in just your business. If you're wondering why something isn't working the way you want to, or you have an aspiration to broaden the scope of your business or get into new lines of business, get somebody who's been in other businesses, right? Because you will never accelerate your growth or accelerate your problem solving if you bring the one slice vertical type person in. So I think it's horses for courses in that sense. It's like, the better you understand what you're trying to accomplish with your business, the better you understand whether diverse experience or really deep single industry experience is likely to get you where you want to go faster. I think ask the question for yourself before you start asking the question of the people you're talking to about maybe coming to help.
Now, you spent the last year or so as a chair for McKay CEO Forums, and you're facilitating peer learning for results-oriented leaders. And you and I talked about that lonely at the top feeling. That's what McKay's all about, right? For CEOs, C-suite executives who are experiencing that lonely at the top feeling. And that's not only felt by CEOs, but that lonely at the dining room table, I guess, feeling for fractionals, which is me right here, right now. So there's a very similar type of loneliness there. And I'm curious, when you're sitting in those forum rooms and you've, facilitated some forums at this point, you've got some experience under your belt. And I'm curious, what are some of the problems that CEOs are sharing with you and putting on the table that they feel, I can't really bring this to my executive team, to my C-suite peers. It's just not the right place, or I don't feel right about it, so I'm bringing it here. Give us an insider view of what some of those hot topics are.
Yeah, it's interesting as the conversations, especially as the groups spend more time together and trust builds, how conversations that so far they seem to start with people issues, team issues. I have a team that's not performing the way I want them to. I can't really think of a way to motivate them differently or reward them or, hit them with the stick or the carrot or anything like that. So performance or fit within teams, that seems to be a pretty common place that folks get started. And I think that's because that's an other problem, right? So when you're sharing confidences and you're building trust amongst a group of people, and by the way, as you know, in these groups, nobody around the table competes, in business. They're all from different businesses, but they all have the same types of challenges. And an easy one that we have in common is our team's not performing the way we want it to, or the way we were expecting. So because those are other challenges, it's pretty easy to start with those. You're not putting yourself at risk. You're hearing the experience of others around that table who have had to deal with similar types of challenges. And I really, I thrive in those conversations because so far, pretty much every time somebody brings one of those up, I'm like, oop, I've had that one before, right? So I know I know what that feels like. So as the trust starts to build, as people make connections, and what I see them doing is, we meet every other month for a day. That's not a lot of time. It actually adds up to about 1% of your time is spent doing these meetings. So it's not a big time commitment in that sense. So people start to make connectivity or connections between each other separate from the meetings, right? They're on the phone with each other from time to time. And as that starts to happen, the trusted network effect comes in. And what I'm hearing now with the, with the folks around the table is they are more and more willing to bring an issue to the table, bring an issue about my child is doing this, or bring an issue about, I've had this issue. It's a personal issue, and I need to hear from people if you've had to deal with something like this, a health issue, for example. So that only happens as trust builds, right? So the idea with these groups is that you stay in and you stay engaged. The longer you stay engaged, like over multiple years, the tighter the trust binds you together, and the more willing you are to bring out the really, oh my gosh, keeping you awake at night kinds of challenges. And that's what I'm starting to see now. It's very gratifying. I mean, the great thing about these groups, and I spend a lot of time making sure that I put people together in groups that really mesh well. We think a lot about what we call best fit, right? It's not a random thing. These need to be people that you can build trust and rapport with over time. But as that builds, I can see that we're having a more and more profound effect, beneficial effect in a non-judgmental way on people's lives, not just on their businesses. On their businesses, yes, but on their lives too. And that's really gratifying for me.
Yeah, I so much believe in the power of peer groups. I mean, I was in EO for a number of years in forums, and I remember coming into some meetings, and I thought, give the scorecard of personal, family, business scale of 1 to 10. And I came in, a couple of times feeling like I'm zeros on all three fronts. And you get at the table and you hear people going around the table doing their updates of, what's going on in their lives. And very often, as bad as this might sound, the way it comes across, but there was just about every time somebody who had a worse problem than I did, which made me feel better.
Yeah, it helps. Sometimes it helps to know, like, your issue can drag you down pretty quickly, right? And to know that even if your issue is different than somebody else's, that other people experience the same thing can lift us up. And here's an effect that I've seen. I felt it myself, and I've seen it in the group. That issue that is all encompassing, right? It takes up so much of your bandwidth. We call it the lying awake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling problem, wondering what I'm going to do about this. Just the actual act of saying it out loud in a non-judgmental space diminishes the problem, because now you've put it out into the light of day, and you see it and you're like, oh, wait a second. Maybe it's not quite the monster that I thought I had in my head. And that's a great place to start. And then when you go around the table and people say, oh yeah, wow, that's a big one. I've had to deal with something like that as well. And let me tell you about my experience and, what the decisions I made and how that worked out. And you're like, oh my gosh, these are things that people not only have to deal with, they can deal with. And once you have your mindset switched like that, you're now in a much more positive place. Your rational brain starts to kick in, right? The lizard brain loses power at that moment. Your rational brain kicks in and you're like, okay, actually I can wrap my hands around this thing. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to get solved in 5 minutes. I guarantee these problems don't get solved in the room, but that you get a starting point. I call it the thread to pull on, right? Something new and different, right? Pull this thread and you get started. And that sense of taking a step forward is huge in terms of being able to address the challenge that's in front of you.
Switch gears a little bit, talking about fractionals. When you and I spoke a few weeks ago, you said something that I found really interesting, and it was about the perception of fractionals. And you were sharing with me that you noted that many people assume fractionals, I think you yourself included, assume fractionals only work with businesses who are in the $2 to $10 million range. And I was curious to dive into that a little bit. Any idea what gave you that impression, why you thought that or think that?
I mean, as with a lot of these things, Robert, I'm going to backtrack probably just slightly.
Go ahead.
Generalizations, right? They're rules of thumb. They help you get started on a conversation. It's not the end of a conversation. It's the start. But here's the thing, right? If you're small, if you're bootstrapping your business, a lot of the energy, a lot of the momentum, a lot of the work gets done by the founder. And then eventually there's the first couple of hires, right? And you get this thing up and running. Well, you don't need a big marketing strategy. You don't need a CFO to help you figure out, how are we going to manage this part of our, financial strategy, because you haven't been around enough yet to need to worry about the financial strategy or the marketing, marketing at that level. So you're going to try to do some of it yourself. Now, usually I hear, and this is the way I hear it, everybody's going to have a slightly different story. I hear, you need to ramp up your financials first. But, even that comes down to, what are you good at? Right. So if you spent most of your career as a CFO, you probably don't need your financial to be done first. Here's where I think the challenge comes for a lot of business owners, entrepreneurs, is they're not good at recognizing the things that they're really good at or not good at. And they are too willing to spend too much time struggling with things they're not good at, rather than figuring out how to pay somebody a little bit of money to get it done. Right? What you and I can do with, we both have marketing in our background, and that CMO approach is we can see and execute on, develop and execute a strategy in marketing practically on site these days, right? We see what you're trying to do and like, okay, I know what you should do. And if I'm, at this point, I'm not the best person to do a lot of things. I mean, just because I used to do SEO doesn't mean that I can do it today. But what I can bring is a good understanding about what you're going to need and how that's going to fit in your portfolio of effort. I can help you define, objectives for it and, rough out a strategy. And then I can help you find the person or the company that can do it for you, right? At a level that's going to accelerate your growth as opposed to be a time drag for you. And I get it. If you're undercapitalized, the idea of paying for something, anything, right? It can be a showstopper until you get to that point where you've got enough revenue, enough cash flow coming in. Now, I think of the 2 to 10 as kind of a place where now you're going to start bringing in fractional expertise at that senior level, because now you need somebody who can think through, especially if you're thinking in terms of growth, which a lot of folks obviously are. Say, if I want to accelerate my growth, am I going to be better off doing that with a manager that I pay $60,000 a year to, who has never done this before? Or am I going to be better off paying, who knows, maybe paying that much, but bringing in a portion of somebody who can do this at a very high level, right? Who's led organizations and who can do the thinking at a much more rapidly and can give me way more value. At that 2 to 10, you're probably not in a place where you want to have a whole C-suite, COO, a CFO, a CMO, head of, chief revenue officer, commercial officer, and all those pieces. You like, that's too much overhead for me right now. So you bring in a piece of it. And then once you get, and it might be at 10 million, it might be at some other threshold for different businesses. And based on your own experience and where your strengths are, you say, okay, now I actually have enough activity happening, enough, our trajectory is strong enough, fast enough. I want to grow enough. I'm going to hire full time, because hiring the full time is going to be, relatively speaking, a good investment. And whether it's 5 million or 10 million or 20 million to get, say, oh, I need a CMO. I don't know. You're going to know that. I think the key to it is to understand at each stage of your business's life, be honest with yourself. What am I really good at doing? Right? And what am I not great at doing? What's dragging me down? And think about what's the best resource I can afford at this stage of my business to help me get to that next level. And, this is actually has come up a lot in conversations for me in the last few months. Anytime you say, hey, I can hire a junior and get this done, you are basically shackling yourself to that person to teach them how the business works and hope that they can get it done. Your ROI on them is going to come much later. Even though it seems like less money out, you're going to get fewer results. So a little bit of saving up and, kind of sucking it up and say, okay, I'm going to get a really experienced person in here could help you just, 2x, 5x, 10x the trajectory that you would have been on if you tried to do it yourself. And long run, you're going to get more out of it. And you're going to love your job a lot more because you're not doing stuff that you aren't good at and it's dragging you back.
Yeah. But at the same time, you make a good point. There's some risk tolerance there. If, you hire the junior, you're going to get your ROI later, but you can get away with paying a much lower amount, and you know what you're going to get from that junior from day one. They're going to get some stuff done for you. Whereas taking that leap of faith that, all right, I'm going to spend a lot more on a fractional, or a full-time C-suite hire or senior management level hire, and hope that it pays off, at a much higher ROI, which is going to take me a little bit of time to figure out. It's not everybody's appetite that's up for that as well.
I'd still love to see, the entrepreneur, the leader of this growing business, have a really honest conversation about what am I really good at. And if you grew up in business as an operator, you're a COO, you love, you're making widgets and you love running the factory, hire juniors there because you want to be in that part of the business anyway. And then hire fractionals to be the CFO and look after your money so you don't have to, or and organize, figure out how to organize and talk to the banks and do all the things that CFOs need to do, right? Or hire the CMO to give you, or a new revenue leader to give you build up momentum on the sales side so that you can make more and more of your widgets. Like, be realistic about that, right? Don't hire junior in things that you're not good at. I think that would be my rule of thumb.
That does make sense. Now, got to come back to something you said a few minutes ago. I'm sure there are still a number of fractionals who are listening and are screaming at their device saying, this guy's way off base, man. I only work with companies under $2 million. That's all I do. And they need me all day and all night. And it definitely, there's a budget issue, but I do know a lot of fractionals in the Fractional Pros Canada community who do just focus on those startup and earlier stage businesses. And what they will say is those are the businesses who need fractionals the most, because very typically the founder, and this is generalization too, but it's probably true in at least half the time, the founder often starts a business because they've figured out some product that it seems like the market needs. So therefore, they're the product person, right? They're specialized in product. They have no clue about marketing, about finance, about structuring a business, operations. And that's where a fractional can fill in the gaps. Now, what often happens is they hire one fractional, and that fractional ends up also taking care of everything else because there's just no one else to do it. And the fractional just sees there's so much need here. And because the fractional understands how all of the different areas of a business need to play together, need to be working properly, they end up, the fractional, COO that you've hired to help you is all of a sudden now helping you out with finance and marketing as well. That's a common scenario. But all that, yeah. And there's also a lot of, we have to not forget also about the segment of that under $2 million business who are being funded and backed by VCs or private equity companies. So there is a little bit more funding available. And in fact, in many cases, those VCs are going to insist that founder get some help from fractionals and the like, because they understand the value.
Yeah. If they're funded, the nice thing is a lot of VCs, especially if they work in partnerships or, in organizations, they often bring that expertise to the table for the companies that they fund. They're like, yeah, we're not giving you our money without the insurance policy if we're also giving you the people that you need, right? And putting them in place. You're going to pay them, but we are going to insist that you have them and we're going to help you source them, right? So there's trusted partners in that. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Robert. There, every organization has, that whatever the inflection point is where they need to bring in that extra resource. Again, fractionals who, this is my view. And I should probably preface this. Like, if you looked at my resume, which I know you did, I haven't started up companies. I've worked in big companies, right? So I've been the CMO. I've been this chief customer officer, commercial officer, right? They're bigger organizations. So that is the perspective that I often bring to these conversations. But if you're as you described that, if you are a fractional and say you're a fractional CFO and you're getting pulled into ops or marketing conversations, you're not setting your boundaries very well.
Agreed.
Right? Because you're trying, I get it, you're trying to help, but you're not adding value. Right? If your answer is that's what you should get a fractional CMO for, then you're adding value, because you're like, you're not paying me to do things I'm not good at and you're not good at. Right?
Yeah, 100%. That's one of the traps of working as a fractional is that scope creep. And again, especially in a smaller under $2 million business where there's no budget, But there's always a way. There's always a way. And in fact, a fractional can bring even more value to the business by going to the founder or CEO and saying, hey, I'm not the right person to do this, but I know somebody who is. And let's have a conversation with them. Let's figure something out because you need their help here, and I'm not the right guy to do it for you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the way to approach it. I have a question for you. Um, so as a coach, one of the things that, we sometimes struggle with, and I think fractionals often have this conversation as well, is, if we're just trading our time for money, there's a limit to how much we can ever contribute, right? To our own objectives, in an hourly rate kind of a way. Are fractionals, especially fractionals working with smaller companies, good at pricing to value or constructing deals where it says, if I can help you to move from here to here, I get something at the back end of that helps me share in what the value I created, as opposed to just it's going to cost you $250 an hour every time you pick up the phone to me. Are they good at that? And is that something that the market is asking for yet?
So first of all, the best practice of a fractional to structure an engagement is not charging hourly rates. It's charging a fixed monthly fee. And that fixed monthly fee is based on first determining what's the scope of work and what are the goals. When I come into a company, what I want to do is I want to sit down and first figure out what's the 2-year vision for marketing. Where do we want the company to get to on the marketing scene, and how does that tie in with the company's overall goals? And then let's reverse engineer that. Let's cut that down to 90-day, sprints, quarterly goals, and then monthly goals, and then have a very tight scope of work. And going back to what you were saying before, the way that you kind of avoid that scope creep is having a very clearly defined scope of work. So everybody's really clear about what we are working on and what we're not working on. And when something, the shiny object, the squirrel comes around, and the CEO or the founder, and this especially happens with, startup companies and younger companies, where all of a sudden they think, oh, I just ran into a friend and he said he's killing it with this new app. It's like, well, great, we can integrate that, but here's what we were working on. Are we going to add to it? In which case the rate's going up, or are we deprioritizing something here and we're going to do this? So that's how you keep that in bounds. But to get back to your question, yeah, it's typically not an hourly rate. An hourly rate is I think a bad idea for the business and for the fractional, because right away the business owner now is aware that they're being billed on an hourly basis. And so now somewhere inside them, there's a voice saying that fractional is going to try to rack up as many hours as they can because it's to their best interest. So that's just not a good way to go. Mm-hmm. And then as far as being offered, if you hit, if the company hits X revenue or X profit or some additional, percentage that we achieve as a result of your efforts, you'll get a bonus. That's up to the fractional because there's some risk involved. And usually that means that you're taking you're going to charge a lower monthly rate and you're risking something. Most fractionals who don't hop onto that bandwagon recognize that at the end of the day, the fractional only has so much control over so many levers in the business. And there's so much more that's actually going to affect what that outcome is or isn't going to be. So it's often a very risky proposition mm-hmm. to kind of sign up for that. But that being said, there are exceptions, and I do know fractionals who do that. I do know fractionals who will accept some equity in lieu of getting paid for a certain amount of fees, etc. There's all kinds of that we see. But in general, I think most fractionals are like, I'm a fractional. My goal is to hire my replacement so that in a couple of years from now, I leave and you've got a full-time CMO that I helped you hire. So I'm not here for a long time. I'm here for a good mm-hmm. time, so to speak. So right. I don't want equity. I don't want bonuses. I want to do the work that we agree on that's outcome-based and structured properly in a scope of work.
Okay. And that makes sense. Two thoughts come to mind. One is maybe it's a little bit more of a coaching thing where we talk about to help manage the expectation about what it costs to have somebody work with you on this stuff. We say, what's the outcome? What are you looking for? Is this $1 million idea? Right? What's $1 million outcome worth to you? Right? And suddenly you're not talking about hours or retainers or anything like that. You're talking about is it worth 5% of that or 10% of that or some percentage of the outcome that you're helping them achieve? So that's a conversation. I hear that happening in coaching circles. And the other is, when I get it with the monthly fee, that makes sense. And the one thing I would remind anybody who, says, yeah, I go the monthly fee route, is your client is doing the math. They are figuring out how many hours you said you're likely to work on their account and what the monthly fee is, and they're doing the math, what's your hourly rate. So they know in their minds, it comes back to that, even if you are, not doing the every 6-minute increment like a lawyer might be doing, right? They do the math.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And it doesn't surprise me. At the same time,
Yeah.
Typically I'm not going to keep track of the hours that I'm working.
Oh, it's a far better way to go. I'm 100% on board with, a monthly fee is way better than an hourly rate. I just don't want anybody to be, thinking that somehow hides an hourly rate. I know that one because, from my experience in the travel industry, right? When we put together packages and say, oh, you can have all of these things for a fixed price, people do the math. They are figuring out how much of that is the room and what's a breakfast cost and all those things. That is a basic human behavior that you encounter frequently, right? It's like, they understand. They're doing it in their head going, oh, I know how much you're charging me for this and this and this.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. And I think moving to outcome-based engagements is becoming the way to go more and more, especially now that we have all these AI tools on the scene. And now you get clients who are like, well, you must work faster now that you use AI tools. So that $5,000 a month that you were, charging a year ago should be like $2,500 a month now because you're doing half the work. And, that is just the wrong way to look at it. You're missing all the experience that comes with it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So keeping it outcome based,
that's right,
is what really makes sense for both parties at the end of the day, from where I'm sitting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the human mind is the human mind, right?
100%.
So speaking about pricing, you have a history of repricing an entire business. You had an experience at Amica, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah.
Where you improved growth by 5x by changing the pricing model.
Yeah, it was a pretty interesting thing. So Amica Mature Lifestyles is in the senior living business. Still is. They're called Amica Senior Lifestyles now. So we had this dilemma. And actually to sort of give you a way of thinking of it, this tracks actually back to when I was at Four Seasons and I was in the reservations department. And I actually wound up, based on my experience with reservations, and then I went into the marketing department, I wound up giving talks to the reservations folks to help them with this particular phenomenon. Reservationists they made more than minimum wage, but it's the kind of job that maybe you make $20 or $25 an hour, right, to answer the phone. And so, and for a lot of people, it's a part-time job, or it's a lifestyle thing that's just enough to kind of keep things going. So you work in a certain mindset when it comes to where my money goes, like how much money do I have and where do I find value? And when somebody would get on the phone and say, I want to make a reservation at your resort in Maui, and then I want a room for my nanny, and I need another room for one of my kids who's a little older. And immediately what happens is you start looking at the rates and you're like, oh my gosh, you can be paying like $5,000 or $7,000 a night to do this. Let me talk you down from that. And the reason that people want to talk you down from that is because they're relating the value equation to the money they earn and the money they have. So I would go to them and say, okay, look, the challenge that you have here is, if you have, if you make reservationist money, it is a huge amount of money that you're talking about to go and stay at that place for a week or 2 weeks, right? But if you've got $100 million, it isn't, right? So think about what what your customer is thinking of in terms of the value equation. Okay, so now we go to Amica. What was happening? So if you move into one of these places, they're rental accommodation, and they come with a set of services. There's a dining room, so you have lunch and dinner there. There's a gym, so you have a gym membership. There's a spa, you get certain services there. There's medical staff on site, nurses, practical nurses, and so on. So there's a lot that goes into. So it's a fairly expensive place to live. Like just rule of thumb, say $5,000 a month to live there. And when you think about a 1-bedroom apartment for $5,000 a month, you're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. And so when people would call and say, hey, my mom is interested in moving into this place, because typically kids help their parents in this, usually the eldest daughter. There's a long story about how that whole dynamic works. And you call in, and if you got, depending on who you got on the phone, right, people would quote the price, and they would generally quote the price that is like what it's currently going for, or the sort of the minimum number they could find. And what we discovered was every time that happened, you set the expectation for the customer at that number. And now when they did choose to move in, you really can't rent it to them for anything else. Well, rentals in certain jurisdictions, rent controls affect what happens in these places as well, right? So there's a limit to how much you can move things up. So when we said, okay, here, that's the dilemma we're having, is people are like, oh my gosh, these are expensive. I better give them the lowest number I can give them right away. And like, now we can never get that list price for anything. So we basically changed the rules and changed who was allowed to quote and how you would quote, because it was a behavioral thing. It was the behavior of our staff was affecting our ability to grow our revenue, right? The people who come in saying, I would like to live at your place, they understand that Amica is at the premium end of the retirement living spectrum, and they're generally people who can afford it. And, a lot of our places were in Ontario. And if you live in and around Toronto, and you just sold your house for $2 million, that's a lot of months of living in a senior living place, right? So the customer's ability to pay wasn't driving this. It was the staff's reaction to what it costs to live there that was driving this. So we just repriced, and we said, okay, we're going to have a minimum price and a list price. So like in a lot of other industries, there's a list price for the thing that you're buying, an MSRP, right? And we just said, we're going to have that, and we're going to quote list price. So we just changed the rules. So if anybody called in and said, I'm interested in living in your place, everybody had the same sheet, right? And the sheet only listed what we now called the list price, which was a plus 10% roughly, right? Growth. Because without going into too many details of it, when a unit changes or turns over, that's the only time you can get revenue growth in that business. So, as I said, quote that price. And then if somebody pushes back on it and says that's too expensive, you say, okay, be happy to have you have a chat with the general manager. And only the general manager was allowed to negotiate price. By doing that, we just basically helped people get more comfortable with two things. One is that the people who are calling typically can afford it. If they can't, they'll tell us right away, and we don't have to worry about that too much. And there's one rule that everybody follows, and only one person in the place who can change that rule. Simplified. So it just simplified and gave us a pathway to grow. So that's what the repricing did. It was just a recognition of where the surprising truth was that the price resistance was actually coming from our own staff, not from our customers.
That's a great example. That makes sense. There was clearly a problem there.
versus, the how the staff was approaching the pricing of the brand versus the pricing the brand merited. What happens when you're working with a company where they're clearly, their margins are too low and they could most likely be charging more, but they're afraid of damaging their brand by raising the prices? Have you ever coached anybody through that?
Uh, yeah, I mean, the short version of it is I say there's really only two sustainable positions in the marketplace, right? Cheapest or best. And it's pretty hard to be the cheapest in most businesses. So what you want to do, first of all, is you want to really establish what are we best at, right? And then really think about like what's the value proposition that we're putting there. Think in ROI terms, not your ROI terms, but your customer's ROI terms, right? So this is similar to what we were just talking about with Amica. It's not what I think it's worth. It's what the customer thinks it's worth, right? How do they find value in it? And if you can show them why and how your product or service helps them achieve a higher return on their investment, they are going to be willing to pay more. And you don't need to leave money on the table. Sometimes this is the same phenomenon. It's like, where's the price resistance coming from? It's us not having the nerve to charge what it's worth, not the customer not having the ability to pay what it's worth. Now, if you are in market, and this I've seen this happen in even some really small examples. The demand profile for something changes really radically. COVID did that on some products. Like some things got really valuable surprisingly quickly. But people who used to buy it at a lower price would just squawk, because you're saying, oh, I want to double the price of this now. So what you might have to do is you might have to grandfather certain clients, right? And say, okay, we are going to give like a 3 or a 5 year runway. Depends on the product or service you're selling, of course, whatever that timeline is. We might have to give some runway to bring your pricing a little closer to what the true value is. But because you've been a good customer and because we set you at this lower level, we're willing to make that investment with you, right? That trade. But every new customer coming in gets a different pricing sheet. Right. And it's the true price to value. And that new customer comes in and says, oh, it's worth that. And they just, that's their starting point. Now, you depend on a certain asymmetry of information when you do that sort of a strategy, right? In the hotel business, you can't get away with that for very long because people do sit around the pool and say, how much are you paying for your room? And it happens all the time. So if you're in a business where there's a lot of transparency about pricing, that strategy probably doesn't work very well. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to switch from your own price resistance, right? I just need to have the confidence to charge what it's truly worth, right? To get to the point where, you move this thing up to a place where the customer can still get really good value from it, but pay you more and get you to the place where you have the profitability and the sustainability that you need.
Yeah. And a lot of fractionals, struggle with that as well. And especially when they're starting out, I speak to a lot of fractionals who are just moving into the fractional space after being in corporate for years. And one of the questions I get a lot is, how do I charge and how much do I charge? And, one of my answers is always, whatever you think you should be charging, double it because you're probably way too low. You're undervaluing yourself.
So a good friend of mine who is a partner at a big consulting firm gave me a tidbit of advice a long time ago. He said, and what he said stuck with me. So, when we are in our executive job, we understand what our base pay is and our incentive and whatever, and we can divide that by 2,000, which is roughly the number of hours we work in a typical year. I mean, more, I know, and you can come up with your hourly rate. You say, okay, well, if I was getting $200 an hour to do that job as a full-time employee, maybe I'll charge $250, right? Well, the rule of thumb that he gave me is like, especially if you're a single shingle practitioner, you are probably going to put in 1,000 hours of business development and 1,000 hours of paid time over the course of a year. You really need to charge double what you used to make just to get back to where you were.
Right.
at that job. And if you have any aspiration of going higher than that, you're going to have the nerve to say, I'm worth a hell of a lot more to you, right? Because I'm jumping in with my huge toolkit and great experience, right? And I'm not going to be here for a long time. So when I set my rate, when I set my expectation about how much, because even if you're doing a monthly fee, you are doing the math as well. You know how many hours you think you're putting in to generate that monthly fee. And you know that you still have to go to networking events, and you still have to talk to clients, and you still have to write proposals and negotiate contracts and do all that stuff that's overhead, right? So you better have the nerve to really believe that you're worth it. And what you have to do is show the value, right? The value proposition, the return on investment, and target clients who can actually afford to pay. Right. So this was a thing. Like, I learned this very early on at Four Seasons Hotels. It is not for everybody. We didn't market to everybody. Right. It was not an all comers kind of a thing. We targeted we had a very clear understanding of who our customer was, where they lived, how much money they made, what their families tended to look like, what their business profile was like. We understood who we were talking to pretty well, because we knew that we were charging at the premium end of the market. And I mean by a significant premium over the next best chain of hotels. And we could get it because we knew how to target those people, and we knew how to deliver value to them.
Great perspective on pricing, Michael. Let's wrap it up with our infamous now last question on every podcast, which is, if you could put one message on a billboard for millions of business owners and fractionals to drive by and see every single day on the highway of life, what would you be putting on that billboard?
Running a business is not a solo venture. Don't try to do it yourself. Get the help you need. How's that sound? I tried to keep it billboard length, outdoor media length.
Running a business is not, what was it? Not as easy as it seems.
It's not a solo venture.
Not a solo venture. It is not.
Running your business is not a solo venture. Get the help.
Get the help that you need.
Bring in the experts. You will go further faster, and you'll have more fun running your business, right? If you're not trying to spin every plate and keep it up at the top of the stick.
Speaking from experience, that is great advice. Michael, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. It was good fun.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. If you're a fractional professional based in Canada, we'd love to have you join us in the Fractional Pros Canada Facebook group, the home for Canada's fractional community. It's where Canadian fractional executives connect, share insights, and help each other succeed. Until next time, I'm Robert Mendelson, Fractional CMO. May your impact be full-time, even if your hours are fractional.